Frank Costello didn't run New York like a movie gangster. He wasn't gonna shout, flip tables, or make speeches in smoky back rooms. He wore clean suits, kept his voice low, and shook hands with the kind of men who use private elevators. If you had money in this city from the 1930s through the early 1950s and you wanted to gamble without leaving Manhattan, you didn't need a neon sign. You needed a phone call, a name, and a doorman who already knew you were coming. The rooms moved around: quiet apartments in Midtown, private suites off Fifth, back floors over legit clubs, because that's how Costello liked it. Discreet, controlled, and full of people who could afford to lose. He didn't need the street to love him. He needed the city's decision-makers to feel comfortable losing chips in his rooms and then returning the favor when he needed a favor. That's the real story of the secret New York casino world where millionaires lost everything. Not one address, not one chandeliered parlor, but a network that lived because the right people wanted it to live. He learned the city during Prohibition, alongside names everyone knows: Luciano, Lansky, Adonis, moving liquor at a scale that kept whole neighborhoods wet while the law said dry. When the liquor ban ended in 1933, a lot of bootleggers ran out of road. Costello didn't. He shifted to gambling because it ran on the same logic: steady demand, repeat customers, and a price for protection. He built the business on three pillars. First, the private salons: cards, dice, the occasional wheel, always with a house edge and a quiet exit. Second, the bookmaking: the citywide web of numbers and sports bets that never slept. Third, the machines: slot machines tucked into back bars and soda counters from the boroughs to Midtown, each one dropping coins in his pocket one pull at a time. The machines are what most New Yorkers remember when they talk about the day the city decided to pretend it had never met Frank Costello. In 1934, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia staged the cleanup. He sent cops to smash the one-armed bandits tied to Costello's network, and he made a show of dumping them in the water. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. That was the message. The city was done looking the other way. It hurt, but it didn't break the business. Slots were only a cut of the pie. The real money stayed tucked behind apartment doors, where the police couldn't grandstand without risking the embarrassment of hauling out bankers, judges, and producers in tuxedos. So Costello kept the rooms moving and kept the invitations tight. He didn't deal cards or shoot the dice. He took the percentage, a little from every pot, a fee on the room, a cut for protection, and a tax on anyone who wanted to run something under his umbrella. Joe Adonis, Joe Dotto by birth, was the partner who made sure the line ran straight. Adonis could dress a room, hire a crew, and keep a game stable when a guest started chasing losses he couldn't afford. If a salon got too much attention, it closed on Tuesday and reopened on Friday somewhere else with the same rugs and the same staff. That's how they stayed ahead of headlines that could ruin the clientele. The guests came because the rooms were safe and the credit was good. Some nights you'd find a Broadway producer playing cards 2 chairs down from a Wall Street man who smiled like he slept 4 hours a week. Sometimes a politician would sit in for an hour, lose enough to feel it, and leave with the kind of gratitude Costello could call on later. Nobody said names out loud. The dealers were trained to shut their eyes to anything they shouldn't see. And I owe you signed with a monogram pen, a wedding ring set down on green felt at 3 in the morning. 2 lifetimes of quiet money sliding out in one bad night. Police raids did happen, but they weren't the main pressure early on. The sharper heat in the 1930s came from prosecutors working bigger targets. Thomas Dewey, the special prosecutor who made his name in that decade, went after the organized rackets that fed New York's money machine. Dutch Schultz, then Lucky Luciano. Those courtroom wars changed the board, but didn't end Costello. Luciano went away in 1936. Costello adjusted, kept the room civilized, and doubled down on political insulation. That was always the difference. Other men made enemies. Costello made introductions. He didn't try to be mysterious. He wanted to look like a businessman who attended the right dinners. The press called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld because power flowed through him without the usual noise. He understood how the city worked. Cops answered to precinct captains, who answered to politicians, who answered to donors, who answered to the kind of men sitting in his salons after midnight. If you asked him what he did for a living, He had a dozen polite non-answers. He helped people. He invested. He looked after friends. And behind each of those phrases was a ledger with names who always returned calls. The losses in those rooms weren't theatrical. There were no speeches, no overturned tables, no threats. The worst nights were quiet. A man would realize sometime around 2 a.m. that he'd stepped past where he promised himself he'd stop. He'd ask for a marker, get it, and keep going because he wanted the night to end different than it was headed. By dawn, he'd sign the marker, shake a hand, and walk out with his coat over his arm, thinking about what he was going to sell or who he was going to disappoint to make the number right. The house didn't need to shout. Enough people paid on time to make the math work. If you're looking for the crack in the armor, it shows up on television. In 1950 and 1951, the U.S. Senate's Special Committee to Investigate Organized Crime, the Kefauver Committee, brought the country into the living room of the underworld. The hearings were televised. America saw mob bosses asked straight questions. When Costello took his seat in 1951, he refused to show his face on camera, so the country watched his hands. Calm, soft, careful. He answered until the answers weren't useful anymore. Then he didn't. The question that stuck, "What do you do for a living, Mr. Costello?" His answer, "I spend a lot of time helping people." It was the kind of line that sounds smart until it plays on a loop next to the words organized crime. He got cited for contempt of the Senate. The courts backed the committee. The sentence came, 18 months. He served about 14 and came home in 1953 with a reputation that never fully recovered. By then, New York had changed. The rooms still existed, but the pressure against them wasn't just a moral campaign. It was political, televised, and organized. The cleanest rooms stayed alive the longest, but the cushion around them thinned. Costello was still Costello, connected, unflappable, but the Genovese wing of the same world had other plans. Vito Genovese wanted the power Costello held, and wanted it without Costello. The move came in 1957, through a face no one outside the life knew yet. May 2nd, just after 9 at night, the lobby at 115th Central Park West. Vincent Gigante, young then, not yet the chin the papers would learn later, stepped out with a gun. The shot grazed Costello's head. He went down hard, bleeding but awake. When the police asked what happened, he gave them something calm, something designed to close the book. "Tell them I'm still around." It wasn't bravado. It was an exit line. He stepped back after that. The message had landed. He was alive, but the future belonged to someone else. He didn't want to die over a game he used to control with phone calls. The world he built had always relied on control. That's why the secret New York casino scene worked under him and barely worked without him. You kept the guest list small. You moved the rooms before the press found a pattern. You paid who needed paying and kept the temperature low with anyone who didn't. When the television era made secrecy a joke, when national hearings turned whispers into headlines, the rooms started to feel like liabilities instead of assets. Ask around long enough, and you'll hear the losses that never made the gossip columns. The producer who watched a show's payroll go to the wrong side of the felt. The lawyer who borrowed until his house wasn't his anymore. The banker who asked for one more marker and realized his reputation was worth less than the card he was signing. Those men didn't file police reports. They didn't sue. They paid, or they negotiated, or they ran. Costello's rooms didn't chase ruin for sport. They offered ruin as a service and let men choose whether to buy it. People like to say the city was more corrupt back then. Maybe. What's true is that it was more private. The money moved in envelopes and the enforcement moved by suggestion. Nobody needed a scene if a phone call could do the work. That's what made Costello different from the men whose names sell movies. He didn't want to be feared in the street. He wanted to be required in the office. He was the person you called when you needed the night to go your way. And the city liked him that way until the day it didn't. He died in 1973, retired, calm, a survivor in a business that doesn't let many people leave on their feet. By then, Las Vegas had turned gambling into a corporate product, and New York had decided it didn't need backrooms to pretend it was honest. The salons were memories, the machines were long gone, and the men who used to walk into unmarked doors after midnight had learned to keep their thrills on planes to Nevada. The rooms that once tied judges to bookmakers and producers to precinct captains had given the city something it doesn't admit out loud, a place to lose without being seen. If you walk Midtown at night now, you can see the old bones under the new glass. Blocks that used to host quiet floors now sell shoes, or boutique workouts, or hotel suites with minibars that cost more than the rent used to. There's no plaque for the salons. Nobody's gonna give you an address. The point of those rooms was that you couldn't point to them. They existed because men with money needed them to exist, and because a man like Frank Costello knew how to keep the doors open without leaving fingerprints. This is the real story of the secret New York casino where millionaires lost everything, a network run by a quiet boss who built his power on access, credit, and discipline, protected for years because the people who should have closed it liked the way it made their nights easy, and dismantled not by a single raid, but by the slow pressure of public attention, televised hearings, and a bullet that said the peace treaty inside one family was finished. There's no one room to visit, no roulette wheel in a museum case. There's a city that learned how to hide vice in plain sight until it couldn't anymore. The men who lost those nights almost never talked about it. They paid what they owed, they adjusted their lives, and they made sure their names never landed in the papers. Costello didn't need to threaten them. The city threatened them for him. Reputation did more work than any enforcer could. That was the system. Risk what you can't say out loud and pay for the privilege of doing it where no one will ask you to explain.